A milkmaid knocked on a stranger's door with 2 bottles and a price of 10 cents each. He answered with flour on his shirt and said, "I'll take 2 if you join me for breakfast." What she didn't know is that the empty ranch he just moved back into was the center of a 3-year-old lie that had already ruined one man's life. Stolen thousands of dollars in land from half the valley and was quietly, patiently coming for hers next. Montana Territory, 1888. Susanna Kerr had been carrying her family's debt alone 2 years, certain nobody in Amber Falls could be trusted enough to help her carry it. She was about to learn that the man who bought her milk twice a week had spent those same weeks building the exact case that would take down the one man responsible for both of their ruin, and that, the closer she let him get, the more dangerous that same man was about to become. Stay to the end. Somebody drives stakes into the ground behind her milk house before this story is through, and it's not a boundary line they're marking. Susanna Kerr was on the road before the sun, and this was nothing new. It had been her life 2 years since her father died in the spring of 1886 and left her 6 cows, 40 acres, a mother whose health had never fully recovered, and a debt she'd been paying down month by month without asking anyone for help. She didn't know it yet, but the winter of 1886 had only been the start of the trouble. The winter that followed the one everyone in the territory still talked about, the one that killed cattle by the thousand in the snow, had wiped out half the small operations in the valley. The neighbors who survived it knew exactly who had bought up their land for pennies on the dollar afterward. One of those buyers was Silas Corbin. Susanna carried her bottles in a wooden crate she'd built herself from boards salvaged off a fallen barn. To keep the milk from turning in the summer heat, she kept it in a small milk house built over the creek behind the barn, running water underneath. Shade above, the only icebox a family like hers could afford. That was how it was done in Montana, and it worked. The route took 3 hours on a good morning, 9 stops, starting with the Hendersons at the north end of the valley. The list had changed the month before. The Boone property had sat empty 3 years since Levi Boone had been accused of stealing cattle off the Henderson ranch and disappeared before the matter could be settled. 6 weeks ago, his younger brother had arrived from where nobody quite knew and started putting the place back together. She knocked twice. No one answered either time. On the 3rd Tuesday of September, she knocked again, and this time the door opened. The man was 28, dark curling hair, the look of someone who'd been up for hours. Flour on his shirt, coffee in his hand. "Fresh milk," she said, holding up the crate. 10 cents a bottle. He looked at the crate, looked at her. "I'll take 2, he said, "if you join me for breakfast." The Boone property wasn't what Susanna expected. The kitchen was clean, the iron pans scoured and hung by size, the smell of coal grease replaced by wood ash soap and fresh coffee. A window over the sink faced east, letting the morning light in at just the angle that made the whole room feel warmer than it was. Micah Boone moved through that kitchen like a man who knew every inch of it. He scrambled the eggs without ceremony, cut the bread without fuss, poured her coffee before asking how she took it, and when she reached for the sugar, he already had the tin on the table. Which meant he'd expected her to stay. "You're Levi's brother," she said. "I am's Micah, Susanna Kerr. My family runs the dairy on the south end of the valley." "I know. I've seen the wagon. You've been here 6 weeks. I've been learning how this valley works," he said. "Who talks to who? It's easier to understand a place before you try to be part of it." She ate the eggs, which were good, and the bread, which was better than good, and drank the coffee, the best she'd had since her father died. She didn't say any of that. She said, "What happened to Levi?" His face went still, like a door someone holds before deciding which way to swing it. "He was accused of stealing 12 head off the Henderson ranch 3 years ago. He said he didn't do it." "How do you know?" "Because I know my brother. And because those 12 head turned up the following spring, branded a different way, on a property that got bought up not long after by a man who had every reason to want Levi discredited." "What man?" "Silas Corbin." Susanna went quiet. "I know that name," she said. She didn't tell him everything that morning, only that Corbin ran the mercantile in Amber Falls and had a hand in half the valley's business, and that his name had a way of turning up in transactions no one could quite explain. She didn't tell him about the debt. That was her own business, and she'd been carrying it alone 2 years. She left the Boone place 40 minutes after she arrived. Same time Thursday, Micah asked at the door. She looked at the empty bottles in her crate. You only took 2. I'll need more by Thursday, he said. I'm planning to bake again. On the drive home, she thought about Corbin, about Levi, about 12 head of cattle, and a man well-connected enough that nobody asked hard questions. She thought about her own debt and who held it, a question she'd been putting off for months because some answers, once confirmed, can't be unconfirmed. She decided she was going to find out who owned the care note. Thursday, she came with 4 bottles. He'd put together a real breakfast, bacon, biscuits, eggs done a different way than Tuesday. You planned this, she said. I knew you were coming. Seemed reasonable to be ready. This is not a man who needed 4 bottles of milk. I've been baking, he said, and left it at that. She looked at him a long moment. Micah, why did you come back here? He thought about it, not the quick answer, the true one. Because Levi's somewhere out there, and whatever was done to him was done here. And the only way to fix it is to be where it happened and understand it well enough to undo it. He looked at his coffee. And because the property's ours and I'm not going to let it be anyone else's, that's 2 reasons. There's a third. He paused. The third one's what got me out of bed this morning. She almost smiled. He saw it start and she saw him see it, which was enough to make her look at her biscuit instead. They talked an hour. When she stood to leave, he walked her to the wagon. Saturday, same time. I don't run deliveries on Saturday, I know. I wasn't asking about the milk. She confirmed it on a Monday at the county recorder's office in Amber Falls. The original note had been held by the First Agricultural Bank. It had been transferred 14 months ago to Silas Corbin, but there was something else in the file, something the clerk had no reason to point out, and she nearly missed. Buried in her father's original loan papers from 1885 was a cosigner clause. The name on it, faded almost to nothing, was the same one. Gideon No. Silas Corbin. That meant Corbin had known about the debt, the spring, and the property's value since before her father died. It meant he'd held a financial interest he'd never disclosed to the family he was quietly buying out. Under territorial law, a cosigner who purchased a note without disclosing that conflict to the original borrower wasn't operating in some gray area. It was fraud, plain and documented right there in his own signature. She stood at the counter a long time, walked out onto the boardwalk, and did the arithmetic. The interest rate on a transferred note ran different from what the bank charged. The final payment she'd planned for March wouldn't be enough, 8 months if she was lucky. She thought about the spring on the east edge of the care property, running clean 60 years, and how under Montana territorial water law it was worth more than the 40 acres above it. Because whoever held the water rights controlled everything built downstream. She thought about Corbin's mercantile 2 miles downstream of that spring. She understood. She didn't tell Micah, not yet. It was her problem and she'd been handling things alone 2 years. He'd been working the problem for weeks, not out of vague suspicion, but the way you solve anything worth solving, going back to the start and reading it all in order. The start was the Henderson Ranch, fall of 1885. The 12 head turned up the following spring on a small property in the North Valley, one that was absorbed into Corbin's holdings not long after, sold for well under what the land was worth. The owner left the territory fast, and no record explained why. The brand on the recovered cattle was the Boone mark, altered, and extra iron worked into the design in a way that took knowledge of the original to disguise properly. The man who'd reported the theft to the territorial marshal wasn't Henderson. It was Corbin, who had no cattle on that range and no obvious reason to be counting someone else's herd. He'd simply mentioned in passing seeing the Boone brand where it had no business being. The marshal's original investigation had been thin, no warrant, no witnesses taken. The case closed the moment Levi ran. Micah spent 3 weeks writing letters to anyone who'd been in the valley in 1885. 2 people wrote back. One, a woman in her 60s who'd lived there decades, had seen Levi the night before the cattle went missing, miles from the Henderson Range, helping pull a stuck wagon off the South Road with 4 other men who could vouch for him. None of that had ever made it into the marshal's file. Micah knew it wasn't enough on its own to reopen anything. He'd need the territorial marshal to agree to a formal review with a warrant to examine the county's branding records, which would take weeks. He wrote to the marshal's office in Helena requesting exactly that and attached the names of his witnesses. The answer came back in October. The marshal would come to Amber Falls in person with authority to examine the brand records and take depositions. The same week Micah went to the county recorder's office himself. The same Monday Susanna had gone, neither of them knowing the other was there. He told her on a Saturday what he'd found about the debt and the spring because it was her situation and she had a right to the shape of it. She listened without interrupting. "I knew about the debt," she said when he finished. "Found out Monday, and you didn't say anything. It's my problem, I was handling it." "You've been handling it alone 2 years," he said. "That doesn't mean nobody else can help. I don't want charity. It isn't charity. I've got contacts at 2 ranches in the North Valley who'd buy straight from you if you could expand production. That's a market, not a favor. I've also got an empty barn with room for 4 more cows. In exchange, you tell me everything you know about Corbin's dealings in this valley." She considered it. She was practical. She'd built her own delivery crate out of scrap lumber and reworked her route 3 times to save time. The offer made the kind of sense things that are worth doing tend to make. "All right," she said. Corbin heard about the marshal's inquiry sooner than anyone expected. A clerk at the recorder's office owed him favors going back years. He didn't back off. Corbin had come through the die-up of '87 by buying land from desperate people, and he wasn't the kind to fold over one old witness and a stack of paper. He started a rumor that Micah Boone had an interest in the care place beyond what it looked like and that the interest had a name, the Spring, and he did more than talk. One night in October, 2 men working for Corbin came out to the care property line. They hadn't come to burn anything or steal anything. They'd come to measure. They drove stakes into the ground along the creek that fed Susanna's milk house, close enough to the spring that the meaning wasn't lost on anyone. One of them knocked down a section of the stock fence on his way out, letting 2 cows loose on the road. Not an accident, a message. Susanna found the stakes the next morning, out in the dark looking for the missing cows. She stood over them a long time before she pulled each one out of the ground. She didn't tell her mother. She told Micah, and this time she didn't hesitate. He looked at the stakes on the kitchen table. "That's not a rumor. That's intimidation, and intimidation leaves a trail, a rumor doesn't." He brought the stakes to the marshal, still in Amber Falls, reviewing Levi's case. The marshal examined them, noted the maker's stamp burned into the wood, the same lumber mill that supplied Corbin's mercantile, and added it to what he was already building. What neither of them yet knew was that the stakes had been Corbin's first move, and not, in his own mind, his best one. A man who'd built his whole fortune on knowing exactly what people were willing to accept in exchange for looking away did not, as a rule, escalate to threats until he'd exhausted the considerably cheaper option of simply paying someone off. He came to the Boone place himself 3 days after the stakes, riding up alone in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who'd never once in 20 years had an offer refused. "Mr. Boone," he said, not dismounting, "I understand you've been writing letters to Helena on your brother's behalf. Admirable. Family loyalty's a rare enough thing these days." He looked around the property, the mended fences, the fresh paint on the barn. "You've done good work here restoring the place. Be ashamed to see all that effort come to nothing over a misunderstanding 3 years old. State your business, Corbin." "My business is straightforward. I'll buy the Boone property outright at a fair price, considerably fairer than what most operations got after the die-up, and you know it. Enough to set you and your brother up comfortably somewhere the past doesn't follow you quite so closely. In exchange, I'd ask you to let the matter with the marshal run its natural course. Old cases have a way of simply not producing enough evidence to matter when nobody's pushing quite so hard to find it. You're asking me to sell my family's land and drop the one chance my brother has at clearing his name. I'm offering you a considerably easier life than the one you're currently building," Corbin said. I'd think carefully before turning it down. I found in my experience that most men eventually accept the sensible offer. It simply becomes a question of how much trouble they're willing to go through first. Micah looked at him a long moment. You said something to me the day I moved back into this kitchen. You didn't say it. Susanna Care's father wrote it in a ledger you thought nobody would ever read closely enough to understand what it meant. A cosigner clause with your own name on it 4 years before you started buying up half this valley for pennies. I've read it. So has the marshal. Something in Corbin's face didn't quite hold as steady as the rest of him. That's not an offer you're making me, Mr. Corbin. That's a man trying to buy his way out of a fraud charge before the paperwork catches up to him. I'll pass. And I'd think carefully myself before you ride out to threaten anyone else's fence line before this is through. Because the marshal's already got the maker's stamp off the stakes your men left at the Care place. And that's the kind of thing that turns a fraud case into something considerably harder to buy your way out of. Corbin sat his horse a moment longer, then turned it without another word and rode off. He did not return with a second offer. Micah told Susanna about the visit that same evening, and she was quiet a long while after he finished. He came to you first, she said. Not me. He came to whoever he thought was easiest to buy. I expect he'd have come to you next if I'd said yes. Micah looked at her steadily. I didn't say yes. I know, Susanna said. I think that's the moment I stopped being careful about what I let myself feel about you. Even so, for 2 weeks, Susanna stopped delivering to the Boone place. She left the bottles at the gate and drove on. She told herself it was caution, that she couldn't afford to be tied to a land dispute with Corbin watching every move she made. It was easier to say that than to admit she was afraid, not of Micah, but of what it would cost to keep getting closer to someone and lose him, and the spring, both to the same man. He left the payment in the envelope every time and didn't push. On the 15th day, he came out to the road. I know you heard the rumor, he said, and I know the stakes scared you. I want to tell you one thing and then I'll go back inside, and whatever you decide after that is yours to decide. He held her eyes. I found the spring in the county records 2 weeks before I knew about your debt, found the debt after, understood Corbin's plan after that. I didn't help you because of the water. I helped you because the same man who ruined my brother's life is trying to ruin yours, and staying quiet about it wasn't something I was willing to do. She stood there holding the empty bottles. The spring's yours, he said. It'll stay yours. I've got no interest in your 40 acres or your water right, or anything on the Care place except the woman who delivers milk before sunup and builds her own crates and won't take help without making the trade fair. She was quiet a moment. I owe you an apology, she said finally. I knew you well enough to know better. I took the easier answer. The easier answer is the one that doesn't make you look straight at something. You look at everything straight on. It's one of the things he stopped. He hadn't meant to say that much. Come have breakfast. It's your route, she said. I'm done with the route today. She opened the gate. He held it for her. Micah brought everything to the Amber Falls community meeting in November. The witness from the South Road, the altered brand records, the suspicious land sale in the North Valley, the hidden cosigner clause in the debt, the stakes bearing the mill's stamp, and Corbin's own attempted bribe, which the marshal noted with particular interest as evidence of a man who understood exactly how much trouble he was in. By then, the territorial marshal had a warrant signed in Helena, not to arrest Corbin on the spot, but to formally summon him to answer for fraud on the debt, and to reopen the Henderson cattle case for good. Corbin knew the meeting was coming. He came anyway. Not coming would have meant admitting something he hadn't decided yet that he'd lost. When Micah finished, Corbin stood. Old paper's worth nothing, he said, voice dry. An old woman swearing she saw a man on a road 3 years back in the dark isn't proof of anything in a territorial court. Maybe not alone, the marshal said from the back of the room, holding up the warrant. But alongside an altered brand, a land sale that doesn't add up, a cosigner clause you kept from your own borrower, and a bribe offered to a man investigating you. It's enough to bring you to Helena to answer for fraud formally, on the record. Corbin looked around the room, 60 people who'd known him 20 years. Looking back at him now, the way a community looks at someone it's realized it trusted too long. There was nowhere for him to go and no one left to stand up for him. He sat silent, knowing the summons would be carried out whether he cooperated or not. He rose again only when the marshal walked him to the door. The room stayed quiet. Then the schoolteacher, who'd been in Amber Falls longer than anyone in it, said, "Well, does anyone have other business?" And the meeting went on because a community goes on. Levi Boone came back in December. He'd been in Oregon under another name since he ran, not out of guilt, but because with no proof in his favor, staying meant a noose or a cell for something he hadn't done. Micah's letter took weeks to find him. He arrived on a Tuesday, the day of the Boone delivery. Susanna was at the gate when the wagon came up the road, and from 50 feet off, she watched two brothers see each other for the first time in 3 years. She set the crate down and drove home. She cried in the barn 20 minutes, hadn't done that since her father's funeral, then washed her face and went to check on her mother. Micah came by that afternoon. "He's home," he said. Thinner, angrier than I expected, which is actually a good sign. "I'm glad he's back. He wants to meet you. He's heard plenty about the dairy." He looked at her. "Susanna Care. I've been baking bread Tuesdays and Thursdays since September. I've had the coffee ready before you got here every time. I spent 3 months finding out exactly what trouble you were in and doing something about it. Not for the spring, not for the land, for you. I'd like to court you properly if that's something you'd consider." She thought about the bread getting better every week, the coffee always ready. "Micah, I've been considering it since the first Thursday." He almost laughed. It came out as the smile she already knew, the one that changed his whole face. They were married in April in the Amber Falls church, the valley going green with the thaw. The whole community turned out. After watching Corbin get taken down in November and spending the winter understanding just how long he'd been working them over, Amber Falls had been ready to celebrate something simple since December. Levi stood at the front of the church. He and Micah had been working the property together since December. It had always gone better that way between the two of them. He'd met Susanna on a Wednesday afternoon in the dairy barn and told his brother, "Well, you always did have good sense about the things that matter." Susanna's mother sat in the first row. Her health had picked up since November, not dramatically, but in the way it does when a worry someone's been carrying finally lifts. After the ceremony, Levi found his brother outside. "I'll be needing more milk," he said. 10 cents a bottle," Susanna answered. "I'll take whatever you've got, within reason." "There's no within reason," Micah said. "She's got the spring." Levi looked at the mountains. "That she does," he said, and went off to talk to someone else. The dairy grew slow, careful, the way things that last tend to grow. By the next spring, Susanna had 10 cows and a proper barn Micah and Levi had raised over 3 weekends in February. By the second year, she had a standing contract with 2 hotels in Amber Falls and a reputation that had taken 2 years to build and would take a good deal longer for anyone to unseat. The spring on the Care Place now, by law, the Boone Place too, ran clean, same as it had for 60 years. The water rights sat properly recorded at the territorial office. No one questioned them. Silas Corbin was taken to Helena to answer the charges not long after the November meeting. The case dragged through the winter. He never came back to Amber Falls. No one ever heard from him again. On a Tuesday morning in the second spring after the wedding, Susanna loaded her crate into the wagon before sunup. Micah came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. Same route. "I'll have breakfast ready when you get back." She climbed up and looked out at the dark valley ahead, the same route her father had started. The one she'd kept alone 2 years and had since kept with someone else. "Micah," she said, he was still on the porch. "Thursday's bread, it was better than the week before." "I know, change the ratio. Don't change it again," she said. "It's right, it is," he agreed. She drove off down the road. The Montana morning opened up around her, vast and cold, just starting to turn from black to the first dark blue of day. That same week, a letter arrived from the territorial court in Helena, forwarded through the marshal's office, a final notice confirming Corbin's conviction on the fraud charges, and buried in a paragraph of legal language neither of them had expected. A restitution order requiring what remained of his seized assets to be distributed among the families whose land he'd acquired improperly during the die-up years. The Care and Boone properties among them. It wasn't a fortune once divided among so many claims. But Susanna used her share to buy the 10 acres adjoining the dairy that had once belonged to the Hendersons before the die-up took their operation too, expanding the pasture enough to double her herd within 2 years. She framed the letter the way she'd once seen a bank note framed behind a bakery counter in a story Micah had heard second-hand from a rancher passing through, a plain record, she told him, of the particular kind of justice that takes its time but arrives all the same and is worth keeping once it does. Everything, the root, the dairy, the spring, the man on the porch with his coffee, was exactly where it was supposed to be. Susanna Care knocked on a stranger's door with 2 bottles of milk and a price. She didn't plan what came after, neither did Micah Boone. He had a kitchen turned east to catch the morning light, coffee on, eggs, bread, and the readiness of a man who'd been watching the valley for weeks and noticed a wagon on the south road 3 mornings running. He said, "I'll take 2 if you join me for breakfast." She stayed 40 minutes, not just for the eggs, though they were good, not just for the bread, though it was better than good. Because something in that kitchen felt like a place that had been waiting a long time to be used right, and what came after wasn't charity and it wasn't rescue. It was 2 people who already knew how to stand on their own, choosing to stand together instead because together was better, and they were both honest enough to admit it. Every morning after he had the coffee ready, every morning after she came home to it, some things are exactly that simple and exactly that hard to find.